Hey everyone, and welcome to the Retro channel and to part 2 of this Commodore 64 repair. Now, if you haven't seen the last video, of course, check out part 1. I'll link to it up there somewhere. But this time we're going to look at the issue with the cassette and potentially user port. They both failed on the previous diagnostic tests, so I want to check that out. But off camera, I did make a few little changes. The first one notably being a new power cable for the LED connector, so it's now one piece of wire instead of 3 or 4. And I also went through and recapped the entire machine. So there were a couple of little caps that potentially have leaked as well. Let me see if I can find them. So I found about 3 of the 10 microfarad caps which are scattered around the board that had a hint of green corrosion on them. So yeah, potentially these would have leaked even more if left on the board. So kind of a good thing that the board was recapped, but in general, I still, I can't really say recap all your Commodore 64s right now, because for the most part, the caps in these don't leak, and the Commodore 64 really isn't that sensitive to, caps that are out of spec. So I did also go around and just clean up the board itself with some Q-tips, and I touched up these solder joints on these 2 ICs that had been previously replaced. So yeah, they're looking a lot healthier. The solder joints that were there before didn't look so great. So yeah, I'm much happier with that now. Apart from that, that is about it. So as I said, what I want to do first is figure out why this cassette and user port are giving us a bit of a headache. And I think it could just be down to dirty connections on both ports. So first things first, let's just clean up these ports. We'll give the diagnostic another run and see if that has made it any better. So yes, especially the cassette port is looking quite nasty, but there is, some oxidization on both of them. And the rear side actually looks quite good. Everything's nice and shiny there, which is kind of interesting because the cassette port, the pins on the bottom are exactly the same as the pins on the top side, so they're just connected together. But the user port has different signals depending on top or bottom side. So I reckon we'll still just try and clean these up and see if that makes it any better. To start, I'm just going to use some IPA on a Q-tip and just give it a good rubbing. Yeah. Right, well, they do certainly look a lot better. They're not perfect still, but hopefully that will do the trick. I want to try and avoid using anything more abrasive, as you'll end up rubbing off the actual gold plating on these contacts. So I'm just sticking with IPA for now. If there's still an issue and I can confirm that it's one of the ports, then we might go something a little bit more abrasive to try and get those up really shiny. In fact, what I should do is the old eraser trick. If I knew where that was. Right, found it. So yeah, just using a pencil eraser can sometimes help bust through some of that that gunk that's on the edge connectors. So let's see if that makes it any better. Yeah, maybe a little bit. The underside is perfectly fine, so I'm not worried about that. But let's just go over it with a little bit more IPA, see if that helped at all. All right, capture device should be ready to go. Let's just see if it's working. Yep, everything looks good, albeit a little bit blurry, but that's just from the older RF modulator. Yeah, we'll get to that in another video. Let's try and hook up the diagnostic harness and see if we get a working machine this time. Well, would you look at that, bloody bonza. Excellent. The machine seems to be fully working. Yeah, that is a win. So there is still a little bit more work to do. I want to get this case cleaned up and the keyboard. I'm pretty much going to pull apart the whole keyboard and clean it out properly. And I also want to maybe put some heat sinks on some of these chips. I imagine the SID is going to get quite warm. Obviously the VIC-2 can go back on. And potentially put some heat sinks on some of these ROMs and the CPU, PLA. And also adjust that clock signal because it may be slightly out. As you can see, the machine works, so it can't be that bad, but we may as well have a really quick look at the clock signal just to see if it's close to the 17.73 megahertz. So I've just got the oscilloscope hooked up to pin 21 of the VIC, and we can see that we're at 17.7354 megahertz on the scope. So all we need to do is just adjust that little trim pot that I had to replace. And we just want to get it down as close as possible to, what does the crystal say on it? 17.73447. 17.734. Somewhere around there, 17.7345 if we round it up. And you can see that the machine is still running just fine. It's not that sensitive, but seeing as we replaced a lot of this stuff in here, we may as well make sure that it's as close as possible to the correct frequency. So yeah, I'm happy with that. We can put the scope back. And just turning our attention to the keyboard, so this was obviously missing a mount on this side, and I guess that's because this originally had a short board in there and the mount for the short board wouldn't have fit for the long board. So there is a keyboard mount for this corner because it lines up with that hole down there, but the other side didn't have a mount. So I did find something on Thingiverse, which somebody created, which is just a keyboard mount for the long board. Now, I did find a couple of these actually. One of them was on Thingiverse and obviously freely available. The other one I found was on a different website, and it did actually cost about 50 Australian dollars just for that keyboard mount. So obviously went with the free option, which isn't maybe not quite as good as the other one because the $50 one actually uses that hole there as you'd expect. This one just sort of sits under the keyboard here, and there is also a mount which sits in the middle here, and obviously there's one for the left hand side which I don't need because I've still got the original keyboard mount for that. So this should work. At least it's going to be better than having a screw go through the actual case. But what I did notice is this middle one, which is supposed to sit in this spot here, actually hits the RF can. So that's not really going to work anyway. I don't think it's really going to be necessary to have the middle one in. I mean, I could sort of cut that in half, but then it's going to lose all its structural integrity because it is just a 3D print, so it's pretty much hollow inside there. I don't think it's going to matter. I'm pretty sure we can get away with just having this left side like that, and that'll, like, the keyboard's firm, like it's only flexing because I'm putting so much pressure on it, but yeah, I think that'll be perfectly fine for what we need to do. Now, of course, before we put it all back together, I do want to give this thing a good proper clean. The case itself is, like, there's a tiny hint of yellowing, but I don't think it's enough to risk retro brighting this one. I think a good clean should get that maybe a tiny bit whiter. But yeah, it is somewhat dirty, so do want to clean it up. And of course, the bottom case, especially around these ports, which always get dirt inside them, that needs a good clean as well. So it'll be some warm soapy water for this, and I'll get these old remnants of feet off here. And for the keyboard, of course, I'm going to pop out every keycap and clean them one by one. So relatively clean, all things considered. There is some hints of rust on some of these springs, so I'll clean them up as well. But yeah, it's not too bad. I've certainly seen a lot worse. Will I take the PCB out? Is that soldered in? Yes, it looked like one of the legs on the shift lock key wasn't soldered in properly, but it is. You know what? I'm going to pull the board out and give it a proper clean inside as well. That's interesting. So, yeah, that actually broke in the middle. It looks like it was soldered together previously, so I guess somebody else has broken it and resoldered it. So I'll fix that up. That's easy. I'll tell you what, this thing makes things so much easier. It's called a Wow Stick 1F. I got it off AliExpress for like 50 bucks, and yeah, it's been great so far. It doesn't have a huge amount of torque, but that's kind of good, as most of the time I'm, you know, just screwing into plastic. So you don't want to destroy everything with some crazy bloody rattle gun or something. It does also come with a huge assortment of bits. This is just one of the little tubes. I think there are 3 of them in the box. So yeah, I'll put a link to this thing down in the video description. I do have a lot of the tools that I use linked down in the video description. Some of them are affiliate links for AliExpress, but I've marked which ones are affiliate links. Doesn't cost you anything extra to use those. Like I literally get a couple of cents maybe out of each transaction. So use them if you want, but if not, just I think you can just remove the S off the front of the links, and that'll remove the affiliate part, but totally up to you. Let's see what this looks like. Oh yeah, nice and clean. I could have gotten away with not removing this, but now that it's out, I'll just give it a quick wipe down. Obviously, don't want to go too crazy on these carbon contacts, because you'll remove the carbon pads and that would be bad. But seeing as this is now removed, I'm gonna let all these out. And then I can run this under some warm soapy water as well. Just got to pop the shift lock key out, which I always forget. I think it goes out through the front. Yes, it does. So all of the plastic bits will get a bath in warm soapy water. I'll clean up these little bits and pieces and wipe down the board, and then we can finally reassemble this thing for a proper final test. All right, so the case has had a good scrub in some warm soapy water. I didn't bother filming that because I'm sure you've all scrubbed dishes before. It's not very exciting. So yeah, it's looking pretty good. I will say that the front of the case has a tiny bit more yellowing than the rear. But again, I don't really recommend retro writing something that only has the slightest bit of yellowing. I don't think the risk is really worth the potential reward. So yeah, this looks pretty good to my eye. So now it's just time to put the keyboard back together, which is always fun and exciting. So might fast forward or skip through this bit, and we'll come back at the end. I did also replace the little wires for the shift lock key. So yeah, I think whoever pulled this apart before just cut the wires to the shift lock key and then sort of resoldered them back together. So you can see there is a little lump in the middle where it's been soldered back together. So just replace both of them. It's much easier. Yes, and I did find the spring for the spacebar because it is slightly longer than the rest. I totally forgot to separate that one out, but as you can see, if they don't stick together, spacebar spring is always a little bit longer. So if you forget that and put the spacebar spring back in the wrong spot, you'll probably notice that one of the keys is firmer than the rest. Now, some of the springs did have tiny signs of rust, but it's just surface rust, so they're still structurally sound. And yeah, again, not really worth trying to replace. I think you can find them on AliExpress or that kind of thing. I don't remember what the exact size of the springs are, but I'm sure they're out there somewhere if ever they need to be replaced. Of course, always handy to have a reference keyboard when putting these things back together. Saves you messing one up and then having to move a bunch of keys around. Alright, this keyboard mount. So it's supposed to sit behind like that, I think. And I've got a couple of nuts and bolts just to mount it properly. Let's see how this goes. Oh, before I forget, better put the can back on the VIC-2. Put some heat thermal paste. That's what I'm looking for. Beautiful. Looks pretty good. Keyboard feels nice, no stuck keys or anything. Got a bit of play, but pretty sure every Commodore keyboard probably does. Yeah, they've all got a bit of play to them, so that's fine. As you can see, those felt feet came off quite easily. They left a little bit of sticky residue, but that came off with a little bit of IPA, so no problem there. Now, I have actually run out of little heat sinks that I usually use, so I'm not going to be putting any heat sinks on today, but I will revisit this machine in the future just to put heat sinks on and possibly sort out the very poor video output from this machine. But for now, I think we're pretty good. Ooh, one more thing. A little bit of the good old 303 UV protectant, just to give it that shine and protect it from UV. All right, and I think that is it. It certainly looks way better than when I started. I don't know if it's as obvious on the camera, but yeah, it looks miles better. So I think the only thing left to do is test it out with a few games. Oh yeah. All right, so I thought I'd break out the old Commodore 1084 because it's a CRT, and who doesn't want to play on a CRT? Keyboard looks to be working just fine. I've got the SD to IEC plugged in at the moment, so let's fire up a game. Got just the game in mind, and definitely one of my favorites from back in the day, and still to this day one of my favorites for sure. Alright, so the game seems to have loaded up just fine, so I think we can call this a success. The machine looks way better than it did before, and yeah, it was quite an interesting fault to try and track down with that 74 LS629, and also those weird bodge wires. Oh, and I should mention, I did figure out that one of the bodge wires was going to the composite video output, which was correct. So if I had have been testing this with composite video, it probably would have worked before I removed those bodge wires and redid them. But that wouldn't have helped for the Luma Chroma output. That was where that 5 volts was connecting to. It was actually connecting to the Luma output on the DIN connector. So I'm kind of surprised that I didn't destroy my capture device by sending 5 volts into the S-Video Luma. But it seems to have survived, and yeah, everything's fixed up now and as it should be. So I'm going to chill out with some Impossible Mission. I hope you enjoyed this little 2-part series. And if you did, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Put a like on the video, leave me a comment if you like. And if you really want to help out the channel, you can support on Patreon and YouTube memberships. Links are down below in the description. But for now, that's it for me. Thanks for watching the Retro Channel. Bye. Let's do this. Bring it.